EWA Radio, the official podcast of the Education Writers Association, and I'm public editor Emily Richmond. The federal government allocated nearly $200 billion to help schools navigate the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on students and campus communities. A new investigation by ProPublica found there's been only minimal tracking and reporting on how those dollars were actually spent. That raises some serious questions about the effectiveness and reach of the funds. Joining us today are the two journalists behind the investigation. Annie Waldman is a staff reporter on the education beat and a familiar voice to fans of this podcast. Annie, welcome back to EWA Radio.
Thanks for having me on.
And making her EWA Radio debut is Bianca Fortis, who is a reporting fellow at ProPublica. Bianca, we're very glad to have you here.
Thank you, Emily.
Annie, I do want to start with you. How did this story end up on your collective desks?
Yeah, so first, a little bit of context about the funding. So as you mentioned, Congress has passed a total of 3 stimulus bills, which gives about $190 billion to the Elementary and Secondary School Emergency Relief Fund, which is called ESSER. I'll probably refer to it a lot, so I'll give it an acronym. And there are some requirements for these funds. But in general, schools can use these funds pretty flexibly. Any of the funds can be used on any expenses that were made after the pandemic was declared on March 13th. And the funds can be used for things like hiring staff members, sanitization, technology, addressing learning loss, reopening schools, virus testing, improving air quality. So really, there's a large swath of things that can be invested in. The one thing I will say is that this amount of funding was a windfall for schools. For some districts, this infusion of funds was essentially, double or triple what they normally receive from the federal government in a normal year. And so many districts have very ambitious plans on how to spend these enormous sums of money. But what we wanted to know was, how are they spending these funds? I mean, it's a big question for journalists, researchers, officials, parents. How do we know that the money is actually going to the most vulnerable kids? And are they getting the help that they need?
Just to clarify, when you talk about all these different categories, so what you started looking at was where did these dollars sort of flow into those big buckets? And there was some big buckets, some of them you described, but then there's another big bucket, isn't it? It's the other bucket.
Right. And that really comes from the federal government started to send out these provisional surveys. So they realized that they had given out all this money, but they didn't really have a clear system set up to start tracking how states and school districts are actually spending it. And so in this survey that they sent out, they wanted to track in the first 6 months, how was the money spent? And there were 6 different categories. And as I mentioned earlier, it's educational technology, anything related to, at-risk children, anything related to mental health, sanitization, summer learning or after school learning. And then, as you mentioned, the big opaque category of other. So we actually looked at the 16,000 provisional reports that covered March 2020 to September 2020. And over half of the $3 billion in aid that was spent during that time was categorized as other, which really gives you no insight into how these funds were allocated.
That big other bucket, that's where you start. You've got 16,000 reports coming from thousands of school systems?
Yep, it comes from essentially all states are responsible for looking at the individual districts. And so the state education agencies collate all this data together and then they delivered it to the federal government.
Bianca, you got a chance to work with Annie on this story. I imagine that was a pretty great learning opportunity considering you're relatively new at ProPublica.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Annie is such a thorough and meticulous reporter, and so it's really a privilege to work with her because I always learn a lot.
Where did you start on this project?
So initially, I had started doing some of the initial research about exactly where the money was going, and I really struggled because there were so many forms and documents and so many buckets of funding that it was really, really difficult to sort through. So when Annie and I started working together, we did some initial interviews that guided us and helped us figure out exactly what the story was. And then that sort of led into that data analysis at the beginning. And then from there, we kind of broke that down and looked into some of the different states and districts that we included in the story.
You did take something of a lead on reaching out to the state agencies. What did you find out?
So the way that states are tracking this really varies. There are some states that have really only posted the total sum amounts of money that districts have been allocated. And in some cases, that information is really hard to find. You kind of have to dig for it. Some states that do have online databases, but the categories that they use to break up the funding are so broad that they don't tell you very much about where the money is going. The best example for a state we found was Georgia, because they put together a really comprehensive database with a lot of details about how the money is budgeted. And the education department there is working with an outside group that's going to do a review of all of the receipts at the end to sort of account where all the money has gone after the fact.
And what was the letter of the law here in what districts were allowed to do with these dollars versus maybe the spirit of the law, what it was intended to do?
Yeah, I think that's a great way to kind of frame the entire pandemic relief fund. I mean, one of the main things with the money is that under the previous administration, they wanted to get the funds out quickly. I mean, this was an emergency. Schools felt this, tidal wave of pressure just upon them in terms of serving all these students remotely, cleaning up the schools, making sure their teachers were safe. And so the priority here was speed over tracking data and accountability. And so I think that the letter of the law is really reflected in that kind of urgency. They wanted to give a lot of flexibility on how that it was spent. So the literal letter of the law is quite broad. Anything that's tangentially related to the pandemic, that could be a use for the funds. So it could be as simple as giving stipends to teachers, for example, to show that their services are appreciated during the pandemic, to different online learning libraries. But the spirit or the intent of the law is somewhat more subjective and a little bit different. That, I think, can really be summed up by two dominant questions. Who were the kids that were most harmed academically by the pandemic and also emotionally by the pandemic? And are these funds going to be directly helping them? And I think that when we talk about the spirit or the intent of the law, that's really what Congress was trying to set up. And that's really what the federal government is pushing. Let's find the kids who are most impacted and let's get them the help that they need. That isn't always clear when you look at the budgets and how these funds are being spent. It just doesn't always trickle down that way.
There's been a number of headlines looking at how this money is being spent, with a lot of critical stories about it being spent on things like athletics fields and sports programs. Those are some of the more flagrant things, I think, that sort of catch people's attention. But I'm wondering, is it overshadowing some other examples of where this money may be going that might be an example of arguably misuse?
That's a great question. I think that when we talk about misuse, as we just talked about the letter of the law versus the spirit of the law, there are really kind of two ways that we can look at it. We can look at it as though, is this actually abiding by exactly what the letter of the law says? Or is this not necessarily in line with what communities want, the priorities of communities? And I think that perhaps some of the more flagrant misuses of the funds might be distracting media attention from looking truly at the priorities and trying to understand, is the funding going to what the community wants, what the community needs? And we tried to really showcase that. We didn't want to just focus on looking at athletics fields and whether, they were appropriately being built or inappropriately being built, or bleachers, and whether that could be essentially defended by saying that the bleachers are being built for social distancing. What we wanted to also show was that by having this data, you can actually understand if the money is going to the highest need students, for example, students with special needs. And that's why we really wanted to look at Fairfax County, where there has been a lot of debate over the past year about whether these federal funds are actually going to investments and interventions to help students with special needs.
When you say Fairfax, you're talking about Fairfax, Virginia, and there's actually a federal investigation that's been launched into whether they were properly serving their students with special needs during the pandemic.
Yeah, that's right. So in Fairfax County, Virginia, essentially the school district spent a lot of their early money, pandemic funding, on ventilation systems, on PPE, which is totally appropriate. But many of the families who came to school board meetings, they were demanding that students with special needs needed more attention. They represent about 15% of the district. And many of them saw their services cut in half or even cut out altogether. And so they really felt that more money should have been spent on those intervention services. And so after a number of families, spoke out at school board meetings and also even spoke out in the press, the federal education department opened up an investigation specifically citing disturbing reports that involve the district's provision of educational services to children with disabilities during the pandemic. And I spoke with one family. The mom's name is Deborah Tisler. She is a former special education teacher herself. And she said that she was heartbroken by the fact that she felt that the district had enough money to provide her son with the services that he needed, but that they didn't actually put their money into the special needs services. Her son has since gone back to school in person, but she really believes that her son is behind where he should be because he didn't have that special attention. When we went to Fairfax County, we looked at their budget. We looked at how much money they were spending on direct services for students with disabilities. And in the first two waves of pandemic funding, which amount to about $160 million, they only spent about $10 million on direct services for students with disabilities. They proportion more money now for students with disabilities. But, in that first year, it was really a question mark of whether that was one of their main priorities.
Bianca, how hard was it to actually get this data before you could crunch it? I mean, were you just filing FOIA around the clock, or were there state agencies that were really transparent and helpful? I mean, I know you mentioned Georgia. I'm wondering what the trend was nationally.
Yeah, I would say nationally, the trend is that there is some data, but it's just not very detailed. And the data that we use to do the analysis actually did come from the federal government because they sort of list out, you can check by state, and they list out individual districts and what those sums are getting. And that's where those buckets come in, those 6 different buckets, and it'll say how much was spent in each bucket.
Was there anything that you saw in these numbers that caught you by surprise?
I would say the biggest thing is how many of the districts categorized their funding in the other category, because the buckets are generally very broad, but the other category is especially opaque. And New York State, for example, every single district categorized all of its funding as other. And when we reached out to the department, the spokesperson told us that they're waiting for further instruction from the federal government for how to further classify the money. But it seemed really surprising to us of just nationwide that was such a trend of just sort of sticking everything into that other bucket.
Whoa. New York State, every district categorized all its money as other.
Yes.
So that includes New York City public schools, the nation's largest school system with about 1 million kids.
Correct.
Wow. Yeah, I would call that a surprise. We're talking with Bianca Fortis and Annie Waldman of ProPublica about tracking how school districts spent or didn't spend $190 billion in pandemic recovery money. Don't miss an episode of EWA Radio. You never have to. You can find us on your favorite podcast app. And thank you to everyone who has taken a moment to rate us on iTunes. Your support and your feedback are helping us to grow. Annie, when we say $190 billion, help us understand, is it in a savings account somewhere earning interest? How do districts actually draw down those dollars?
Yeah, so just to give you a sense of kind of also the timeline for the distributing funds, there are 3 buckets of funding. The first one was labeled as CARES Act funding. So it came from the first bit of legislation passed in March 2020, shortly after the pandemic began. That small bucket is about $13.5 billion. Then at the end of 2020, there was another bucket of funds, which was approved under the Coronavirus Response and Relief Supplemental Appropriations Act, and that's about $50 billion. And then there was a third bucket that was actually just passed in March of this year, and that's another $123 billion under the American Rescue Plan. So there were essentially 3 waves of funding that were hitting school districts. And this funding came directly from the federal government. It kind of passed through the state oversight mechanism. States had to approve the funds, make sure everything was fine. And then they essentially gave districts a green light to draw down those funds from federal coffers. So it's very similar similar to how other kind of federal grants like Title I work. And so you can actually track the funding, the raw data on usaspending.org, I believe. You can go on and you can see, there's a 24-hour delay, but you should be able to go on and see how much money has been drawn down, even by each school district, if not, definitely the state agencies.
One question I have is there a confusion then for some folks about what it means to have the money spent versus the money obligated?
Yeah, so there's been a lot of controversy over the past couple of months because a lot of people are accusing districts of not actually spending the billions of dollars that they've been given. Because when you look at USA spending, to some extent, it looks like the $190 billion, only 10 to 15% has been spent. In fact, Betsy DeVos, when she was still the Secretary of Education, she was even saying that districts weren't spending this money, that it was just still sitting in the federal coffers. But that's actually not true. The way it works is that districts budget this money over an entire school year, but not only a school year, they might budget it for 3 years in advance because this funding can be used up until 2024. So they have quite a large window to use this money. And that's what we call obligation. So they'll obligate that money into, over the course of 3 years. They might hire a teacher for 3 years. And so it will look like only a third of that funding has been spent, but they're going to carry over the funding for the next 2 years as well. And so, there's no way when you're looking at the online databases to tell if that money has actually been set aside for some part of their pandemic plan.
We should make it clear that we're not necessarily talking about cases where you found that people have intentionally tried to hide bad spending decisions. It's more about there's not systems in place to facilitate the reporting and transparency. Is that fair?
Yeah, that's a really fair assessment. And so, as reporters, we have to be incredibly careful that when we use numbers, we actually know what they mean. If we see that, I'm pulling these numbers out of a hat, so they're definitely not true. But if, Texas has only spent 25% of their funds, we shouldn't just report on the fact that 75% of the funds are sitting there unused. We should go and ask the Texas Education Agency, why are these funds still sitting there? Have they been obligated yet? We really have to put on our investigator hat to figure that out.
Bianca, how about you share with us a couple of examples of some of those red flags that you found where districts maybe were making decisions that were questionable?
Sure. So we did see a few examples of districts using their funding on athletics. For example, in Iowa, the Crescent Community School District was using some of its money to upgrade its outdoor stadium. And then in Pulaski County, Kentucky, the school board was using about $1 million to upgrade its track and field facilities. But then I think the most interesting example that we found was probably in McAllen, Texas, where that district is using $4 million to build an outdoor learning center that's part of a nature park that's owned by the city. And we spoke to one parent who was unhappy because the construction of that project won't actually be finished until 2024. And so she's saying that this project is not prioritizing children who are at the school now, who have been impacted by the pandemic now, and who really need help.
Well, that's a great question, isn't it? Isn't a piece of how these dollars were supposed to be prioritized? Wasn't community engagement a piece of this?
So in this case, actually, we had reached out to the district, and the spokesperson actually did tell us that they sought input from parents before they allocated any of the money. And the district feels that this park is actually in line with the needs that the parents had helped them identify.
Annie, were there some examples of where districts made decisions that experts are saying were pretty good ones?
Yes, I've actually been looking at several states in a very detailed manner, trying to understand the differences between ESSER 1 and ESSER 2, how the funds were spent. And what I'm seeing is there are certain priorities that have come up time and time again that seem to be pretty good ones for the first wave and second wave of funding, that being education technology. I mean, this seems like an obvious thing, but all districts should be one-to-one, meaning there should be one device per student. And if you're seeing a district that is not spending money on that or not prioritizing that in the first 6 months of the pandemic, then that's a cause for a red flag. And then, with ESSER 2, the second bucket of money, what I've seen in a lot of states do, which seems to be pretty consistent, is upgrading their ventilation system. They really spent that first bucket on Band-Aid funds, so trying to have nurses get PPE, get the technology. But that second wave of funding really is trying to transform the schools into safe places for students to return to, really allow them to reopen this past year. And so what you'll see is a lot of money is spent on construction or ventilation. And so when you see that, that should actually be a normal thing and a good thing. It just kind of depends which schools they're choosing in order to have those upgrades. That's kind of where your investigation hat should come on, where you see, are they choosing some schools over others in order to invest in?
I think it's probably pretty obvious why the lack of transparency or poor recording systems for where these dollars are going would be frustrating to taxpayer watchdog groups and some education advocates. Why is this a problem, especially though for folks like education researchers?
So, what's crucial to keep in mind is that students have fallen behind in the pandemic. There's a huge issue with learning loss. And so education experts are saying that this is an unprecedented opportunity to support students because this is such a huge sum of money. And educators need to understand what is working and what doesn't. And so if they do have good data, that provides them with the information that they need so that if one intervention isn't working, then they can then pivot and try something else.
Well, I think to do that, you need to know sort of what's happening nationally. And that kind of goes back to my big sort of philosophical takeaway from this story, which is it's really fascinating. The federal government is giving this money to local districts and saying, you know what the students need. You understand where they've fallen behind or what services or programs will best help them. We're trusting you to spend these dollars wisely. But at the same time, they need them to report back and to share as much detail as possible for there to be any kind of national change or some collective understanding of what students need from a national perspective. Is that fair, Annie?
Yeah, absolutely. Giving credit where it's due, Dan Goldhaber at the National Center for the Analysis of Longitudinal Data and Education Research, big mouthful, but he's an incredible guy. He's done a really, really great report called The Once in a Generation Opportunity. His framing is we are giving a once in a generation opportunity. Schools never get this amount of funding. It would be a shame if this money does not move the needle. And what does that mean? It's not just moving the needle beyond our pandemic status quo, but this money can and potentially should be closing the achievement gaps that we've seen in schools over the past couple of decades. But there's absolutely no way for researchers to know if money matters unless we track it, unless we study it. And as Bianca was just saying, we really have to know what's happening as soon as possible so that if we find something that works, if we find that a certain kind of investment works, if a certain kind of literacy program works, more districts can pick this up while they still are within that spending window until 2023, 2024.
Annie, what are some story ideas for education reporters listening who may want to follow your lead and take a look at where these dollars are going?
Yeah, so first, for local reporters, here is what I would do. I would first go to the state agency and I would ask, how are they tracking how the dollars are spent? If they are not tracking the data in a meaningful way, then that's a story in itself because they are supposed to track it according to the federal government. And if they are tracking the data, but the data is bad or it's not clear in some way, then that's also a story because how is the public going to know how the money is being spent? Kind of similar to what we did on a very national level. And if they are tracking the data and you can localize it to your district, that's a great starting point. You can look at how the data is broken down. Are they spending on technology, nurses, distance learning? Are they spending on ventilation or school improvement investments and so on and so forth? And you can also go to the school board meetings, look at the agendas, the meeting minutes, watch the videos of the meetings if they're available, and find out how these decisions were made. Were there key players who kind of directed the funding in one direction versus another? And then always you should be comparing the spending of one district to the districts around it and across the state to make sure that you're not just looking at an outlier, to make sure you're looking at some kind of a trend. And of course, most importantly, speak to kids, speak to parents, and ask them if they're actually receiving the resources that have been invested in. One example of this was that I was reporting in Benton Harbor, Michigan earlier this year. And looking at their budget, it looks like they spent tens of thousands of dollars on computers and iPads, making sure that every kid in the district had access to one. But then you go and talk to the kids and the parents, and I actually learned that they didn't get a hold of the new computers because the order was backed up for months. That's something that you would never be able to tell if you were just looking at some state data set or even a national data set. You would expect that they would have gotten that technology on time, but they didn't. And that in itself can just become a story right there. There have been shortages of technology. So even if you see that they spent dollars on it, doesn't mean that it actually improved the learning environment for kids right in the middle of the pandemic.
You talked about the once in a generation moment. And when I think about the past couple of decades or so of when those moments have come for districts to get big windfalls of money, it's been things like the school improvement grant program, things like Race to the Top. And those programs are often boon for another group, and that's consultants. So I'd be curious to find out what districts are spending on outside experts who are telling them, we'll come in and help you figure out how to spend those dollars.
Oh, absolutely. And there's no shortage of websites. If you just Google ESSER funding, how is it being spent? There are tons of websites devoted to, directing school districts to certain contractors or programs or online reading programs. There's just a litany of things that you can really look into related to that.
It seems to me that this is an opportunity for reporters to really get to know the folks in the finance office who hold those purse strings, not just when there's a big windfall from the federal government like this, but all the time. And then really keeping an eye on district finance is the nuts and bolts of this beat, don't you think?
Oh, absolutely. I think that money stories, school finance stories are really, really hard to make tangible in normal times. Money stories are often really boring. They kind of make people's eyes roll into the back of their head. But during the pandemic, there is that urgency that the money does matter. The money is not just a Band-Aid. The money could actually open doors for these kids and make sure that they are getting services that not only they're supposed to get, but that could change their lives in this very moment. And so I think that people care about this more so than they would 5 years ago or even 10 years ago, or even after the recession. Now is a time to really do these stories and make them understandable for people, especially because there's so much more community engagement right now. If you kind of look at what's happening in school board meetings, people are actually trying to understand what is happening at a granular level in their kids' education, for better or for worse.
Bianca, you've jumped into the deep end of the pool on the education beat. What do you know now that you didn't know a year ago?
Oh my gosh, it's been such an eye-opening experience just to learn more about how the education system works in the United States. And I think the most insightful thing actually has been talking to parents and teachers directly to better understand the issues that they're experiencing as kids return to school, because it's really such a crazy time for them.
I want to thank you both for making time for the EWA radio podcast. I learned a lot from the story.
Thanks so much, Emily.
Thank you for having us.
Annie Waldman is a reporter at ProPublica covering education. She's won numerous honors and awards, including from the Education Writers Association. Bianca Fortis is an Abrams Fellow at ProPublica, also covering education. And that wraps up another episode for us. If there's a story or reporters you want to learn more about, drop us a line with radio@ewa.org. The mission of the Education Writers Association is to strengthen the community of education journalists and improve the quality of education coverage. For more than 70 years, EWA has helped reporters get the story right. Have a great week, take good care of yourselves, and thank you for listening.